within a half a mile. The other thing that is important to note is that there is a provision that you can read on Circle 6 that's an amortization period, which any existing vape shop that is located within a half a mile of a middle or high school would that does not conform to all of the use standards would have to discontinue operation after 24 months after the effective date of the bill. So essentially, in order to provide the vape stores with a reasonable period of amortization to prevent unreasonable economic loss, the ZTA would allow for 2 years after the effective date that the vape shop could continue operating, and then it would have to cease operation and comply with the rest of the use standards. In other words, it would have to relocate to one of the appropriate zones that is a half a mile at least from a middle or high school.
All right, I'm not sure if this is the right moment to try to find the answer to this, but do we license vape shops separately?
We do not, the state does.
The state does, so do
But
we have the data of where those shops are?
So we tried to get it, but it's not, nothing is ever simple. It's not as easy as just saying, what vape stores are licensed, because under the state statutory scheme, if you are a tobacco shop, you do not have to get a vape license. So a lot of stores that are also vape stores don't have to get a separate retail or a separate license for vape stores.
Because they have a tobacco license?
Because they have basically a tobacco license. Now, Park and Planning did provide us, and I'll pass it out.
Oh.
This is something that the HHS committee used. It essentially, you could ignore the green outer buffer. That was for purposes of distinguishing mileage, but that is essentially a circle around existing vape stores in the county.
That is a half-mile circle?
Correct. So the red part is a half a mile. The green part is the half a mile.
Green? I don't see green, sorry, I see pink.
Well, the inside of the pink is green.
Oh,
So it's a mile and a half mile. The white
Buffer.
on ours,
Yes.
we don't have to.
Yes.
Is the half mile, and then
The
the larger.
pink is
So it's really the inside.
the inside
white
of the
circle.
red.
it's the hole of the donut.
Yeah, there you
Yes,
go.
the donut hole.
Perfect.
The
Now you're
donut
speaking-
hole.
Now you're speaking my language.
The donut hole is half mile. Okay.
So that is,
So what you can see is that with a 1 mile, that you are essentially knocking out much of the populated part of the county. With a half mile, there's still some interstitial room.
right.
Okay. The donut hole is a half-mile radius from a shop. Was it from a shop? What is it from?
The shop is in the
Sorry,
center.
from a
Is
school.
like dead center
Thanks.
of the.
From a middle or high school.
Correct,
And the pink area is a mile.
correct.
And the proposal is a half mile.
The proposal is a half mile. The reason these maps are drawn the way that they are is because, and I can start talking about it now or at whenever the committee wants to. There was a discussion among HHS members at the committee as to whether or not the buffer for the bill should be half mile or mile. So this was intended to show the difference between half mile and mile. Ultimately, the committee
Yeah,
did go
sure.
to a half a mile.
Gabe?
Mr. Chairman, thank you. I think that the majority of the correspondence and the majority of the conversations we've had with members of the community were requesting that we actually expand to a mile and include elementary schools, thereby effectively eliminating the ability for vape shops to operate in the county. Because if you include the concentric circles of all three at a mile, then it leaves little to no land left. We wanted to balance and acknowledge that for some members of the community, the vaping products are a better option to tobacco use directly. And we wanted to be respectful of that while also maintaining the balance of addressing the unquestioned epidemic of children and youth getting access to these products. We felt that not only from the sale perspective, but that as you have these stores within schools, they effectively serve as billboards, as people are as kids are walking to and from schools, and that they spend the majority of their time, leisure time, within a half a mile of middle schools and high schools. So we felt comfortable keeping the middle school and high school component, thus significantly restricting where these shops could go, but acknowledging that for some members of the community, they are a resource that they would like to see proceed. So we try to strike that balance.
Thanks. No, I'm glad you did. I mean, the thing I have found a bit difficult in this conversation is that I am convinced that it's really the 7-Elevens and the retail shops where the more problematic products are easily accessed because they're fairly ubiquitous. And the specialty shops are a little bit less of a challenge. I did note in one of the studies that on Circle 63, it says that a number of, what was the percentage? It was a little less than 20%, maybe 15%.
Vape shop,
It says, well, yeah,
14.8% of middle school and high school students.
yeah, it tries to show what type of store they bought from
From vape shops.
vape shops.
8.4% from gas stations.
Right. I do tend to think that our problem is all of the proliferating small retail shops less than the specialty shops.
I don't disagree at this particular time, but because of how quickly we have seen the number of youth accessing these products, unfortunately, we are still early on in this, what I will call, epidemic. And that's why I think it's appropriate for us to continue to take aggressive measures to prevent even more youth from accessing it, because I think that while those statistics reflect current numbers, the numbers are still going up. And so if whatever we can do from a preventive standpoint to prevent them from going further up, I think is reasonable.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Chair Albernice, for being here. And this is an important issue. This might be for staff or whoever knows the answer. So under the half mile that we're looking at here, how many shops would that currently put in violation of this CTA or shut down?
18,
18.
Of the,
22,
There's 22 in the county,
correct.
and 18 would have to move or
Because they're within a half a mile.
because they're within a half mile of this
That's correct. They
current
would have
radius.
to relocate somewhere else.
And the only areas that they could relocate are the non-donut hold, so the white space in this,
The only, no, the donut holes is where they could not relocate.
that's what I'm saying. So the only space they could relocate to is the white space
No, no.
Assuming that it's in the correct zoning.
and the pink space.
they may not be inside the donut hole.
Pink is
They
between a
cannot-
half mile and a mile.
Okay.
just for the
So they could
purposes of
not be within the
question.
donut hole.
Got it? That's
but-
clear.
Yes, but also, it has to be in the correct zoning.
Okay, so if they might not be able to be in the pink or somewhere else because the zoning wasn't right.
Correct.
It'd have to be a CR.
Correct. But even
Zone.
if this zoning is correct, they could not be in,
Right.
In the-
Right, yeah, you can't set up shop at your single-family home, for example.
Exactly.
Yeah, got it, okay. So this would have a significant impact on the ability of, so there'd basically be 4 vape shops in the county at this point.
well, they could relocate.
Unless they relocated near one of the other spaces, that
Correct,
is allowed.
unless they
Okay.
found another place to locate.
Okay. Yeah, I similarly, and I appreciate you tried to balance it here, and I think you did it the best you can with our authority, the need to minimize the opportunity for young people to have access to these products, but also realize, it was an education for me when we had the public hearing about the people who are going into these stores and, the expertise they're getting from people who are trying to have smoke cessation. So it's that part of it is difficult, but I think on balance, I agree with the intent, and we have to make difficult decisions here. So it's one that I think we probably need to move forward with. But thank you. So that was my question, the number of shops and where they could potentially relocate. Thank you.
Now, how are you able to determine that there are 22 shops?
Because Park and Planning told me so. They created this map for me, and they essentially took what was identified as a vape store.
I mean, I suppose they're not that hard to find if you just
Right.
use the Google machine or something like that. Is that it, Greg?
Yeah, it's our research people went through a number of avenues, but yeah, it's wasn't hard for them to pick those up.
So they were able to find the 22.
22, yeah.
Which you would call specialty shops. These are not
Yes.
22 retail locations, obviously.
Right.
These are
They-
your
yeah,
true
they're-
vape shop.
Yes, there are a number of other locations that have the majority of the retail use is whether beer or wine or just other retails that
Right.
they also did numbers for as well. But in terms of true vape shops, 22 and 18 were within the half-mile radius.
Okay. So under this ZTA anyway, 18 of those would need to relocate or shut down.
That's correct.
Craig?
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Chair, and I apologize for getting late to the subject, but let me just say that one of the things that we also need to remember is that we're not doing enforcement now. And many other jurisdictions throughout the region aren't doing effective enforcement as well because they just don't have the resources to be able to do it. Talking to Clark Bile with our Department of Health and Human Services, they don't have the manpower to be able to check and see. So the numbers that you see here that were reflected in what some of the national averages are, it's interesting because NBC4 did a report on some of the other neighboring jurisdictions and found numbers that are a little bit higher than what you see here. And I think that to Chair Albornoz's point, what we're seeing is that, we don't know what the true problem is and how much of the sale actually goes on to underage folks because we haven't been doing sting operations. So we really don't know what the problem is. I mean, it could be significantly less, it could be significantly more. We just don't know. And so from that perspective, it's also concerning because when I look at regionally what's happening and just in, Loudoun County and Fairfax, Prince George's, other places where they've been doing these stings, they continue to not only have retail shops that have violated the law, but also your vape shops that are violating the law as well. Now, again, it's not casting a dispersion, it's just the reality.
You're saying
of-
that they have found in
Yes, violations.
other jurisdictions.
That's right,
that
neighboring
vape shops
jurisdictions.
Were
That's right.
Were selling to underage.
That's correct. That's correct.
minor
That was on the NBC4 report, and so you got the chance to see it directly. And so from that perspective, again, I just want to make sure that we understand the reason why. I know and understand that the majority, I mean, even when you look at the national average, the majority of them are doing the right thing. But the reality is that for us to, cast this wide net and say, well, we're not doing it at all isn't realistic. There are some folks who are, and it's just very interesting. While some of these locations, when I think about the location that's right near Seneca Valley High School, is strategic because you could have done something a little bit further off to where there's also a shopping center. I mean, it's about traffic. And that traffic also encompasses minors as well as adults. And so when you're talking about convenience, the reality is that when you locate in these areas, it's making it convenient for folks regardless of age. And so from that perspective, I think that we need to think about it from that perspective. I know it's hard. These are businesses who are trying to do the right thing for the most part. And, a lot of times deliver a product that people enjoy. Or are presenting a product that may be used for smoking cessation. But the reality is that the more we put this out in front of our kids, the more challenging it's going to be. And so from that perspective, that's the reason why I feel as though going with the model that we have with the half a mile is something that's reasonable.
I would just also add that every medical professional we've spoken to and that has testified has talked about the fact that with these vape products in particular, because although relatively they've been around for a while, it's only in the last 2 years that they have really picked up steam, that they've really picked up interest.
The vaping shops.
Correct.
The so-called specialty
just the
shops.
products that they're selling, not the shops themselves, just the actual vape products.
Okay.
And we've heard particularly from pulmonologists that there will be more long-term longitudinal studies, but what they are seeing initially with patients that they are treating is that these products, although they've nefariously been marketed as being safer than cigarette use and tobacco use, over the long run, they don't believe they will be. And the cases
Yeah.
that they're seeing are substantial. So it's not that these products are,
They're not healthy.
they may help you,
They're
exactly.
They're still bad for you.
That's right.
I mean, I
So-
want to say, if, like, from a
Yeah.
30,000 feet, like, I think these products are designed to perpetuate your addiction.
Correct.
Fundamentally. They help some people move from burning cigarettes to
Right.
this other product, but then they try to keep you doing that for
Yeah.
as long as they possibly can.
Right.
And, I'm a former smoker, and ultimately, you have to want to quit. And, like, doesn't matter what product you use, you have to want to quit. And these are not intended to help you want to quit.
That's correct.
They're intended to help you want to continue using them. And, that said, some people will, we need a lot more aggressive regulation at every level. There are other ways to quit. One thing I keep going back to is, if you really want to quit, A, you just have to do it, and B, there are drugs that actually work more effectively than vaping. You can get a prescription, and the science is very clear that you will be more successful in quitting with a Chantix-type product that actually helps you regulate that. That vaping is maybe a path out of combustible, but some people are able to use it to then entirely quit, but many people just keep vaping indefinitely. And that is also going to be a problem. If you vape for 20, 30, 40, 50 years, you're going to die of something else related to that, and of course, we don't really know what the long-term health implications are of it. My strongest passion here is, of course, around children and young people, and I do think it's clear that they use those other types of devices mostly. That seems to be what the evidence is showing, is it's those little USB type devices that have created the epidemic. And so, we're trying to understand, I guess, how all these things fit together. And I think by moving from a mile to a half mile, this is a measured approach that allows for some shops they will still be shops. They will be operating in a regulatory environment that will then be determined by other measures that we have adopted around flavors, or the state, preferably the state and federal government would adopt around flavors. As you know, I proposed a flavor ban, but I don't think it works very well, because you can still order online. And a lot of people are going to order online. And that's, an underlying problem for us. So until the federal government takes action to deal with the manufacturer's ability to make products in the first place that can then be sold online, I think we're ultimately swimming upstream. Good morning, Ihsan. How are you?
Good morning. Sorry for being late. I thought it was 9:30.
That's okay. It's almost always at 9:30, but we moved it today, especially at 9 o'clock. But you are it's totally fine. All right. Andrew.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thanks. It's been an important discussion, I think, of what is clearly a complicated issue, and I think it reflects, as you were just saying, a couple things. One, this is an epidemic that we are all desperate to try to get our hands around. There isn't a parent, a principal, a teacher, a lot of students that I have spoken to over the last 15 months being in office that this hasn't come up as part of the conversation, and the helplessness that our education professionals and our parents are trying to grapple with. And I think that this is reflective of that, and in that way, I really appreciate the leadership of Councilmember Albornoz and Councilmember Rice on this, and all the work that the HHS committee has done. I mean, this is the land use portion of it, but really a lot of the important and critical work in addressing this issue has been dealt with at the Health and Human Services Committee. I think it also reflects the limitations that we have in dealing with this, and I think some of the concerns that I really appreciate Councilmember Reamer and Jawando mentioning earlier are this, issue that, we're not really equipped like the state and the federal government are to enforce, as Councilmember Rice was mentioning, and prohibit certain products in certain stores. I mean, that really isn't what we're set up to do. We don't have the resources for it, and frankly, the laws aren't even set up particularly well for us to do it. And so there is a little bit of a square peg, round hole of trying to get on top of what is clearly a growing health crisis among our young people that we need to address, but also recognizing that we are limited, and it's a challenge to be able to do that. And I am, as Chair Reamer mentioned, I don't take lightly that this is an aggressive action that has significant impacts on a number of businesses, and that's not something that I take lightly at all. I think certainly moving to the half mile is helpful, to address that balance, as was mentioned earlier, and I think the 2 years as well. I mean, it is not a light action of local government to force a business to move. I mean, that is not a small gesture by any stretch of the imagination, but it will still allow them to exist. It doesn't completely regulate them out of business. And, it's just a real challenge that we face of how do we address this? How do we do what is our number one priority, responsibility, and obligation as a local government and as people in public office, which is to keep our young people safe and to make sure that we're doing everything that we can to mitigate the risk that is posed to them on a daily basis. So I appreciate also what Chair Reamer has said and the very compelling comments that you made, Chairman Reamer, at the introduction of these bills and this ZTA about your history. It's not something that I'm as familiar with. I'm not a smoker. I have never been a smoker, but I've seen it in my own family. I have a family member who early on when I was very young, and that had significant health implications as well that turned our whole family upside down for a while. So, and it was another example of starting the addiction early and not getting out of it until too late. So I'm not something I take lightly at all, not something that I don't appreciate. I thought that some of the business owners who came and testified at the public hearing gave compelling testimony that they are trying. I do believe that they are. But I think that we're struggling and trying as desperately as we can to wrap our heads around this epidemic and make sure that we're keeping our kids safe and trying our best to strike an appropriate and reasonable balance.
Will.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I appreciate Councilman Friedson's comments. I agree. I'm getting more frustrated as I sit here because I'm really mad at the federal government and the state haven't done more and put us in this situation where we're using a blunt instrument to try to conduct surgery. Again, as I said in my first comments, I think on balance we have to do it because we have to do what's best for our children and for our families and try to protect them from this epidemic. But it's really, whether it's the flavors, it's like a repeat. As I mentioned when we introduced these set of bills, I worked on the FDA tobacco regulation issue, and that was a huge problem then with these flavored, types of cigarettes. And I agree with Councilman Friedson. I think I was actually just reviewing some of the testimony here from Vapor Worldwide in Gaithersburg and a letter that was written in and talking about what they try to do and how they're looking forward to enforcing the 21, one of the actions that was taken at the state level to move the age from 18 to 21. and that, you know, kids are going to go online or to 7-Eleven. And yes, that might all be true, but we have to do what we have to do with the authority that we have. And but I did want to say, I really hope, you know, that federal government and the governor and others will move to give us more tools, or to take the authority that they have to get these types of flavors and products out of all stores. I mean, because, you know, we obviously, if we could address some of these other retail or online options, we would, and we can't. And so I just am really frustrated by it, but I did want to say that it wasn't it's not easy decision, because I know there are people who are out here trying to do the right thing, but I appreciate my colleagues for introducing it. I think, again, number one priority for us is making sure we're protecting our children and protecting families.
Okay.
Thanks, Mr. Chairman. Just final two comments. We've gotten a lot of correspondence from other local jurisdictions, both regionally and nationally, regarding these particular bills, because local jurisdictions share our frustration with the federal government's inaction on this, and all of them are looking to figure out how locally they can legislate. And so I do think that beyond the impact here in the county, should we proceed, and I think we will, this will hopefully have an impact where local jurisdictions force the federal government to take stronger action. So I do think in that regard. The timing of this, I think, is important because, you know, the bills were introduced originally in November. We've been holding off to try and consolidate everything, and we are looking at the end of March to be able to vote on all these bills collectively. So our hope is that we can proceed out of committee, but if we don't, and it's completely up to the committee's decision, and no problem either way, but I would propose that we continue to move forward with the HHS portion of this regardless of where we go today, so that we can move this forward as quickly as possible.
Thank you. I mean, I think we're ready to move forward. And Amanda?
I did just want to note for you, starting on page 3, there are two amendments, just clarifying amendments to the ZTA. One we already spoke about briefly, to ensure that the ZTA defines a vape shop as an establishment that devotes at least 51%, as opposed to 51% exactly. That was essentially my error, not including that in the introduced version, so that amendment should be made. Additionally, the planning board and planning staff had raised an interesting question about what an established middle or high school is. And so they had recommended looking at whether or not we should tie that what is established to the use and occupancy permit. So I have drafted an amendment on page 4 that I'll just read it to you. It says, for purposes of these standards, a vape shop or a school is established when the Department of Permitting Services issues a use and occupancy permit. I would suggest both of those amendments for your consideration.
Is that sort of like the who was here first issue?
Right.
Yeah. Okay. All right. Any additional comments? All right. We have legislation before us. Committee members, all those in favor? All right.
With amendments?
With amendments? Yes. Thank you. We're done.